welcome everybody to the first roundtable on prosperity and partnership. I would say that this roundtable is particularly promising and challenging, especially by considering this historical and epochal phase that is making more evident the link between climate crisis, the energy crisis, and the democracy crisis. I think that the Ukraine case and all the geopolitics is making more clear this link between the three levels of crisis. And I also think that the climate change is, of course, not helping us in our choices, and is putting at the first rank the need to shift the paradigm and phase out fossil fuels. I think that we are aware of what's going on concerning climate extremes all around the world in these months, and I think that the heat waves are really unprecedented as magnitude, and are hitting Europe from the north to the south, from UK to Italy, France, and Spain. And of course, such climate extremes are increasing the energy demand and therefore the energy supply systems. And where are we going now concerning that? So I think that is really interesting and promising, this roundtable, and we should put some our 2 cents in the debate to figure out some important tasks, some important suggestions. The main issues of this roundtable, what is gonna discuss and what is going to put in this sharing space. First of all, there is the necessity of developing an international fund to support the developing countries in this just energy transition related to the phasing out and in the non-proliferation of fossil fuel activities. This is the first main topic. The second one will reflect on social welfare in a climate crisis scenario, and on the consolidation of the global governance for a radical transformation of the growth model, challenging the anthropocentric vision. So around main topics, we are going to open and also giving the floor to our special guests. Some of them you already know and you understand also approaches and background. And concerning other special guests, it's better that they present themselves with 1-2 minutes in order to give like the background and the starting point from yourself. So I would give the floor as first instance to Professor Alberto Lanzavecchia from the University of Padova, Department of Economics and Management. Professor Alberto Lanzavecchia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salvatore, and thank you all for having organized such an inspiring conference on climate justice. As you know, probably, I have a background in business administration and capital markets, in banking and finance more precisely, and I'm coordinating the PhD program in human rights. So somehow I would try to link the two former presentations related to how human rights are related to the shutdown, to the phase out from the oil and gas business. And the other is related to Greg, who argue some trade-offs related to workers and social justice at large. I would put on the table my personal thoughts. What is missing so far? So far is missing the financial part of the story. The capital market, the capital market are still missing. I would start by looking at the graphic Greg shown related to the reserve already. The existing reserves related to oil and gas, and to what the maximum threshold we should stop the extraction if we want to meet the Paris Paris targets. Yet, if we look at the financial system, if the financial market, we have to be aware that we are offsetting financial assets as well. I'm referring to stocks prices. I'm referring to pension funds who have invested in those stocks. And we are talking about also the tax revenues. If you look at the account state, the income statement of those companies. So there are two missing dimensions we have to address, namely how the stock market would react to the offsetting of those reserves that should stay below the soil, and the other is related to the strength of the public debt, the outstanding public debt that relies on GDP growth and the tax revenues from these sectors. So to conclude my first speech, my first ideas, is that still if we don't address them, how to offset financial assets that are held by pension funds, closed funds, investors globally from one side, and the other side we are addressing the growth in GDP related to the entire supply chain and the related business, not only for the extraction of the oil, but if we look at the entire use of that oil, we have to address the growth strategy. According to the most updated literature, I'm going to share by chat the link. So far, only 3% out of 1,000 academic journals are targeting the growth in economics, in economic businesses, meaning that how to reduce the use of energy, how to reduce the consumption of natural resources. If this is true, and I guess it's true, still we are missing how to do. So I think in the next year, we will organize the next edition of this conference, but the oil will be still extracting and new oil fields will be discovered and so on and so forth. Unless we address the two main missing part of this story I tried to address so far, that is the write-off of financial assets in the holding of pension funds and closed funds and investment funds, generally speaking, and from the other side, how to offset the tax income generation by government who relies on businesses that, I agree with you, of course, must be shut down, but by doing so, the trade-off is a financial side-by effect that must be considered. So I think to have somehow linked the two presentations, especially Greg and the fellows from Sinha, who try to somehow figure out the rollout of the transition. I'm fine. I give back the floor to Eugenio to follow up the roundtable.
Thanks, Professor Alberto Lanzavecchia, and thanks for giving your suggestions from your approaches that are quite important by considering also the role of finance and economy in these issues. So I would give the floor, introduce John Sinha from UK. John Sinha is a long-standing climate activist. I personally met him more than 10 years ago during COP15 in Copenhagen. We were like, I think for the first time, putting the focus on climate justice issues, and he's also active after his experiences, and he was like involved in the COP26 coalition in Glasgow. So I think that his contribution and his suggestion can be very important. I will give you the floor, John Sinha, and please try to link and to make a link with the topics we are discussing here, and try also to figure out on these two main axes of this first roundtable on prosperity and partnership.
Yeah, thank you, Eugenio, for that. I've shared some things on the discussion board. The first thing that I've shared, the first item which I've shared is the carbon mitigation pathways. And this graphic for me illustrates the fact that because the international community has left the the reductions, we've had 30 years of COPs, and we have had rising emissions. Every year that emissions have been rising means that the mitigation pathways, that is the annual cuts that need to be achieved to for a livable planet for 1.5 degrees, are that much more drastic. And I think we've reached a point now where the ordinary market mechanisms that are proposed to deal with decarbonization and targets in the UK like net zero by 2050 are completely redundant. What matters now is not the net zero by 2050, but what happens in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of stemming emissions. As Alberto Antonio Gutierrez just said, humanity faces collective suicide over the climate crisis. And we are beginning to see the signs of that already here in Europe, and especially in my country, the UK, and in London, where we are seeing forest fires, the like of which we only expect to see in countries like California, places like California. But we are seeing now the impacts really beginning to hit home, and big questions being raised. And I think for us, this is a huge opportunity to start actually making some points, some very essential points. And one of them is that the market mechanisms have failed completely to deal with the problem. That the current energy price rises, the way that the governments have been responding has been completely inadequate and has actually benefited the oil companies. So for instance, when you cut the taxes on fossil fuels, you don't actually reduce the prices, you actually just increase the profits of the oil companies, who have been making enormous historic profits at the moment. And I think, one of the things that I've been involved in, an initiative which I've shared on the board, and I think is a very important one, is the climate jobs report, how we can decarbonize the energy system. The project that I was involved in is a collective effort of trade unionists and climate activists in the UK. But there are similar initiatives in other countries like Norway and South Africa. And I think at the moment it's very important for us to get trade unionists and workers on board on the subject, to point out that actually the solution to the energy and fuel crisis and the climate crisis are actually, there is one solution, that we can have a transition to a zero carbon or decarbonized economy without actually harming people, without creating unemployment, ensuring that people are adequately kept warm in winter, and have houses that can keep them cool in the summer. All these things are possible, but we have to get away from the market logic. I mean, one big problem we have, and I think why we haven't had a transition is your previous speaker mentioned, the valuations of a lot of oil and gas companies are based on their future oil portfolio. So their assets of the coal inventory of oil and coal that they have in their inventory of assets. And these are unburnable assets. So the valuations of these corporations isn't consistent with, limiting global temperature rises by 1.5 degree. And I think we have to break with that logic, with the logic of the stock market, with the logic of valuations, with the logic of economic growth for the sake of economic growth. We need to have a complete 180-degree change in direction. And I think we can, there are the opportunities for us to do that. And that will require the mobilization of civil society. It is essentially a political question, how we actually change, whether we actually succeed in changing. And that is by building the social movements on the ground that can actually bring about the kind of change we want. We are seeing at present, with the rise in prices and the energy crisis, a whole wave of social revolt is now taking place in countries like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and in many other places, I feel, in the coming months. And it's very important that we, as a climate justice movement, offer hope to these people and offer concrete solutions on how this crisis can actually be averted. And I think it's time for us to get out of the ivory towers, out of the PowerPoint presentations, and onto the streets, organizing people, organizing communities, putting forward the demands. I mean, one demand that we could be putting forward is, for instance, in towns and cities, is for free public transport. I think I noticed that the Spanish and German government have actually provided reduced rail travel for the month of August. I think this should become a permanent thing. I think we need to be doing all these kinds of initiatives. And I think that's only going to be coming from social pressure from below, the same way that all social reform historically has occurred throughout the world is through mass movements, through mass revolt and rebellion. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John, for this important contribution. And I would say that public transportation should be like also the way to stimulate and to find a way also to give the opportunity, especially for young people. We are living in Padua, in a university city, and we have another kind of picture. And I would say, for instance, in Italy, after the beginning of the war, the Italian state gave a gasoline bonus to workers to mitigate the increases of prices. So let's see this picture and try to understand if it is sustainable or if it is going in the right direction. So we go ahead. We would have Professor Isidore Yanogo from Burkina Faso. He is part of the scientific committee of the Center of Excellence Jean Monnet, but perhaps due to some internet connection problems, I don't see him anymore. So I would proceed. The Professor Yanogo is working at the geography department, and he's studying and researching in and around climate variability and adaptation strategies, among some topics. And also he's performing some studies on ecosystem and land degradation in rural communities. So we go ahead, and I would give the floor to Greg Muttitt. You already know him very well by his presentation. So please, Greg, give us your 2 cents about these important topics on prosperity and partnership.
Thanks very much, Salvatore. I'll just be very brief here because I captured it very well. And I'm really glad that John shared that fantastic graph on the Padlet by Robbie Andrew at Cicero. And what that graph shows us is that the later we leave it, the faster we have to act. I think one of the problems we have at the moment for climate action is that many people talk as if we were still much earlier in the problem. And so the solutions that get proposed, such as, you know, gas as a transition fuel, or slow emission reduction so as not to disrupt GDP growth, or just a bit more disclosure of climate risk by financial institutions, or trying to research potential techno fixes to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These are all responses that might have made some limited sense when there was plenty of time to act on climate change, perhaps in the early 90s. And I think that's not the moment we're in now. We're in a moment where action needs to be profound and transformative if we're going to avoid severe dangers of climate change, even more severe than we're experiencing already. I think that's really the core problem here. And in my earlier comments, I mentioned the danger of prioritizing one set of workers over another set of workers. I think it's perhaps a cognitive flaw in we human beings that we see the immediate tangible impact that will be felt in 6 months, and we prioritize that. And it's the same when we think about the types of regulation we might apply to companies or financial institutions. We're worried about the short term and more measurable impact, and too much focus on that leads us to ignore the much harder to manage and potentially catastrophic impacts that arise from not acting. I think if we were cognitively more sophisticated as a race, I think we would prioritize the impacts that are harder to manage, because you know, enabling a just transition is not beyond the ken of humanity. How to do this? We have a good sense of how to do this. How to survive a rapidly worsening environment where we're losing ability to, for instance, grow crops. That's a really profound problem. And so I would like to see that sense of prioritization reversed. I think where I so for me, I'm question that we need to slow down or be more incremental. I don't think that's appropriate in 2022, given where we are. I think the really important issues are how do we share things between different countries or between different groups of people, and that's where conferences like this are so important. But climate justice, we need, I think I would argue we have to act dramatically. We have to rapidly reduce use of fossil fuels. But what is important within that is how are those efforts shared? How are those costs shared? And so I'm really keen to hear people's ideas on how can we create financing mechanisms that enable transition in the poorer countries. I think that's an important thing we can contribute in this discussion. And just to name it, I confess myself to be disappointed with the response in Europe to the energy crunch. That so much of it, as Gregor mentioned earlier, is about finding new sources of fossil fuels, when there have been studies showing that Russian supplies can be replaced, the loss of Russian supplies can be addressed by reducing demand and by switching to non-fossil sources. I think those are the kinds of things we should prioritize, because in Europe, I would argue, we should be moving much faster than the poorer parts of the world. And to kind of, Gregor helpfully highlighted that the idea of short-term fixes doesn't work very well because so much infrastructure is long-term. My message to European governments is this really isn't good enough, I'm afraid.
I see people still being shy. I will share with you that there are 4 tips on the Padlet. The first one is, and I agree with this suggestion, it is also important to say the names of the main polluters. And an article from The Guardian is published with 100 companies responsible for the 71% of global emission. 2 tips from John Sinha, and I think it's important also to show the hard calculation, the physical basis of the climate change. And this is the special report at 1.5 scenarios, the special report of IPCC about the socioeconomic shared pathways. And then we have from John some UK initiative about the climate jobs. Quite important also to figure out where we are going when we are talking about climate jobs. There is an anonymous post-it that is characteristics will be shown by reduction of dependence on fossil fuel, reduction of emission, and reduction of all goods which use fossil fuel. So please, people, just share your idea, your thoughts. Don't be shy, and contribute to the debate and discussion. Now we proceed with the roundtable. I would give the floor to Stefan Singer, Senior Advisor of Global Energy Policy at the Climate Action Network, CAN International. He's a long-standing, I would say, environmentally compromised and publicly compromised person from the WWF, Germany, Europe, and international. So, Stefan, if you want also to integrate your thought that you were thinking before in this roundtable, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salvatore, and thanks for inviting me. Let me shortly also make sure that we understand what Climate Action Network International is. We represent about 1,800 NGOs, CSOs worldwide in more than 130 countries. And we work, not the Secretariat, which I'm representing. We represent all issues which regards to climate change, which regards also increasingly on issues which are linked to climate change, but are more social issues, biodiversity issues, inequality issues, which becoming increasingly important if we discuss the issues of partnership, convergence of issues, and trying to have systemic solutions rather than incremental solutions. I think that it's important to keep in mind that if we talk about climate justice, the issue, and I haven't heard it here, unfortunately, I'm sure that many of you think about this one, the issue of social justice and inequality is fundamentally part of climate justice. I'm saying that as the socialist, as a Democrat. I've been advising, I do advise the Social Democratic Party in Germany on climate issues in my personal capacity. I cannot do that as CAN, as you understand. We have been working on issues also with other international socialist parties in Europe on issues, and we came to the conclusions to some extent, not every one of us, I'm not giving you a kind of naive picture here, that the current, and that goes back to our friend Gregor here in the beginning, who gave us an issue where Europe is standing, and I can only agree with Greg, that Europe is far away from taking the lead. I would say among the blind, the one-eyed are kings, and that's Europe presently. The current agreement, formal agreement of the European Council of going to 40% renewables by 2030 sounds like big, given where we're coming from, but it's nothing compared what we can do based on technological, financial capabilities, and what we should do based on historic responsibilities and the moral necessities in terms of historic responsibilities, historic emissions, to basically pay back our carbon debt, our colonial carbon debt. It's not easy to do that. I fully understand that one in times of inflation, in times of the crisis we are facing with the Russian aggression. But nevertheless, it stands out there, and we need to do that. We need to be clear and talk to the facts and the figures and be clear on science. If we want to have climate justice and social justice, then Europe has to reduce its emissions to zero around 2030, around 2035. And that means emissions reductions via renewable energies of 40% by 2030 are not good enough. Even the other number which has been proposed by the Commission of 45% emissions reductions or 45% renewables is also not good enough. We need to go to something like 65, 75% renewables by 2030, and then being carbon neutral without offsets, I'm saying that very clearly, which luckily Europe has agreed. They do not want to have offsets in all the various emission trading systems and others, that is good. But then we need to be clear on that one, carbon neutral, carbon free by 2035, 2040. I think that's the overall challenge, to pay back a certain amount of our long-term carbon back and adding significant amount of money to poorer countries to help them for mitigation and adaptation, which we are far from it. And I think that those are the issues where justice comes in, social justice, international, generational, intergenerational justice, which is part of climate justice. And I think we need to spell that out, although we're not making ourselves popular with that one in the current economic situation. We need to do that one, and we are doing that as CAN. Second point for me is on the issue what Greg has mentioned on the just transition, which is a fundamentally important, necessary approach to manage the big transition. We cannot have, and I agree with Greg, we cannot have the just transition, and I'm seeing this with my discussion, our discussion with trade unions and others. We cannot have the just transition just linked or focused on those who are supposed to be the losers. The coal miners, the oil and gas workers, etc., etc. We need to have the just transition as a positively connotated national and global or regional, whatever you want, project to show also the possibilities for those who win from a just transition. And these are the workers in renewables, the workers who do construction work, in renovation of buildings, etc., etc. Those who work on restoration and protection of forests, tourism workers who look into new models of clean and green tourism, etc., etc. Public railways, public transport workers. So it's just a kind of understanding that the just transition is not something for losers. I'm sorry to say that one, because I'm seeing that one when I talk to trade unions. They're concerned now, because so far the just transition issue had been framed as addressing those who will be losing. And I think we need to overcome that one and have a positive narrative to that one and say where they're losers, they're winners, and we need compensation and reskilling for those who are losing. So give it a positive narrative. I think it's important. For me, the important point is inequality. What we have seen is scandalous, and I think we haven't addressed that one as a community. Even in the academic community, I haven't heard about this one here. We know this from the inequality lab, from our French friends, that in the last 3-4 years, only the billionaires in the US have enriched their personal wealth by $1.7 trillion. The money is stolen from the public. The money is stolen from energy transition. The money is stolen from investment in health, in education, public infrastructure, and climate justice, if you want. But this is not only the US. The assessment goes that it's about $5 to $6 trillion worldwide. The numbers are shaky, but this is the ballpark where the billionaires, and we talk about billionaires already, they're already rich, fat, and big, which are enriching themselves, which I would say illicit, not illegal. What they're doing is legal, but it's not legitimate new money, which is stolen from the public for the necessary investments we need for this big social and environmental transition. On top of that one, we have roughly, this is the assessment of the IMF and others and the World Bank. Again, the numbers are not very clear, but the ballpark is clear. We have been 15 and 35 trillion, I talk about trillion here, trillion US dollars in tax evasion and tax havens somewhere from everywhere, from the richest people in the world. At the same point in time, the 1% richest people in the world cross about between 25 and 35% of emissions. There's a link. So I think we need to address these issues of inequality, social justice, and income taxes, wealth taxes as a fundamental priority, and reduce the taxes for the poor and the poorest. So tax reforms, wealth tax inclusions in our tax models is fundamentally important everywhere. And I'm not seeing this in the debate, unfortunately. We talk too much about technologies. Yes, they're important and they're great and they're wonderful. They need to be supported, but the money needs to come from somewhere. And if we do not address those who are the most responsible for the misery we are seeing, and those who are the biggest and richest fat animals, I'm saying this bluntly, in the world, if we do not address those guys, then we're not getting anywhere. Because over the last 20 years, what we have seen is that the public budgets have decreased. You see, including the US. Every year, we know that the US is closely standing before a financial chaos at the end of the year. And the private budgets of the rich have grown. In that context, we know, and this is my last point, from the international, for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that we have to grow in order to overcome the climate crisis. We have to grow our investments into renewables and energy efficiency in particular by the factor 6 significantly, by up to $2 trillion per year. That sounds a lot. but it's nothing compared to what the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has classified as a currently annually ongoing subsidies to fossil fuels. Mainly the indirect subsidies was air pollution and climate change damages, which are 3 times bigger than that, up to $6 trillion per year. Let's forget that we have about 4 million people dying prematurely from the fossil fuel air pollution impacts. So I think the entire economy is completely screwed up. Sorry to say that one. And I think we need to get, as environmentalists, as socialists, as reformers, we need to get in that debate and put forward a completely different economic model that brings justice, not only climate justice, social justice, equality, fair trade, fair dealing with people, with communities, with those who are affected and those who might benefit into this kind of negotiation. This is not about incremental change anymore. This is about fundamentally changing the way we are dealing with our economy here. Otherwise, I see no way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan, for your important contribution. Thanks for retaking the concept of social inequality in the debate. And thanks also for showing the way and highlighting where the funds and the money are and where are the responsibilities. I think it's quite important to give these remarks. I would just read a couple of tips that we have in the shared space on the web, the Padlet. One is, of course, and for those that don't know, there is the Carbon Tracker web portal. Carbon Tracking is an independent financial think tank that carries out the in-depth analysis on the impact of the energy transition on capital markets and the potential investment in high-cost carbon-intensive fossil fuels. Then we have a tip from Edoardo Crescini. Start applying economic sanction to governments that fail to meet targets. He's answering to the key characteristics for an efficient and effective energy transition. And the other tip is strengthening transition goals and action to fight against climate change. Third one, not only words, but it's time to show facts. So I don't know if there is other people that want to just share, but time is running out, and I would conclude and close this first roundtable on prosperity and partnership.